There's a weird dev testing room still hidden inside Clair Obscur Expedition 33, complete with NPCs, combat, and unique music, and you were never meant to see it. After my last Out of Bounds video, I was pretty sure I'd found everything, and it turns out I barely scratched the surface. This time I found more cutscene bubbles floating around doing the heavy lifting, reused assets hiding in plain sight, and weird stuff hiding below the map. And there's a tiny detail in the ending that made me stop and replay it 3 times to make sure I wasn't just seeing a glitch or something. And what surprised me is how deliberate a lot of this stuff felt. The more you look around, the clearer Sandfall's design philosophy becomes, and you start to piece together how they made a game that feels far bigger than its budget. I'll show you some of these tricks, and at the end, we'll talk about whether that little detail I mentioned is just a dev oversight or something darker. And if you want to explore Out of Bounds yourself, check out the pinned comment for a list of the tools I used. The first thing I want to show you is a zone that you can't reach in normal play, not even with photo mode. This is Sandfall's QA testing room. We have a few notable NPCs in here. The curator, who for some reason is looping that creepy bone-snapping animation from the Moissonneuse Nevron. Then there's the mime from Lumiere, who if you talk to, kicks off the dialogue we originally hear from Sophie.
Hello? Gustav, help!
There's this floating eyeball that just creepily follows your every move, and there's this little gestural merchant named Persic, the same one from Falling Leaves, who seems pretty psyched to be here. There's even a few item pickups and paint spikes you can break. Nothing crazy, all stuff you can find in normal play. And then there are these moving blocks that I guess they use to test collision with the characters. What really surprised me though is that this room has unique music. It's a solo euphonium version of Beneath the Blue Tree, arguably one of the best tracks in the game. Here's a quick sample of the solo and the actual track. Moving through the portal here drops you back onto the world map right outside Spring Meadows. Next up, I want to show you the old Lumiere mansion. We only get a brief glimpse inside when the paintress opens the door for Maëlle. Flying inside, we get a look at what we couldn't see earlier. There are concept art paintings lining the walls, there's a staircase splitting up the middle, the big chandelier. It's almost identical to the mansion interior that we know from normal play. Almost. However, if you turn around, the front wall is significantly different, and that's likely because this version of the mansion actually has to line up with the exterior that we see in the cutscene, whereas the one we normally visit never needs to make sense from the outside and is this blocky mess. Dropping below the map, we find a duplicate of the entrance to the manor. It looks like the devs switched this out with the one we see because of this cutscene. The original entrance is just one solid asset, whereas the one used for the cutscene is chopped into pieces, and it's a little deeper, allowing for the doors to fully open. One of the smartest things Sandfall does in this game is they use these isolated spheres for scenes that need a completely different environment without building an entire new level. You can see this all over Lumiere in Act 3. In one of those spheres is Verso's ending location. Some fans notice that the manor entrance here looks different from both old Lumiere and White Sands, and they're right. If you drop below the map, you can see where the original entrance is floating in space. They likely changed it to make this scene feel like it takes place on the side or rear of the mansion instead of out front. There are 2 more of these spheres in Lumiere. One sits right above the platform before Renoir's boss cutscene. When it's time for the battle, the scene moves up into that sphere. And there's something off about Renoir here. If you flip the camera around, you'll see it's actually painted Renoir wearing Renoir's suit. The last sphere, tucked off to the side of Lumiere, is where you decide the fate of the canvas. You can find the faceless boy here still painting away. These spheres aren't limited to Lumiere, they show up everywhere in the game. Like Maëlle's black and white sequences, a lot of battles like the Endless Tower editions, the Mime and Sunless Cliffs, and even that scene where Alicia enters the canvas. It's a pretty clever way to save a ton of development time and effort. Why build an entire level for one scene when you can just put it in a bubble and nobody ever knows? Before we leave Lumiere, here are a few small discoveries worth pointing out. While you're heading towards Renoir, aberrations occasionally jump scare you and attack. Out of Bounds, you can see they're staged below the map on floating green platforms just waiting to be teleported in. When I dropped down next to them, they clearly noticed me but didn't attack, so I killed all of them. There's also something CL mentions very briefly that completely flew past me at first.
The 32s.
Every Chroma person you fight in Lumiere is an Expedition 32 member. You can see it on their armbands. What's weird though is that some of these Chroma people fighting for Mael also have 32 armbands. That feels like maybe a dev oversight, unless Mael has been quietly adding 32s to her Chroma army while moving through Lumiere. And down at the docks, there's somebody hiding beneath all of this rock. I couldn't clip through all of it cleanly, so I did a little excavation and found Emma, Gustav's sister, still standing there from the start of the game. You can trigger her dialogue and that cutscene from the beginning, but I wouldn't recommend it because it crashes the game instantly. Earlier I mentioned saving development time, and a big part of that is reusing assets instead of constantly making new ones. This is all over the game, but the most interesting example are the Nevron corpses that are scattered throughout. A lot of the aura surrounding Dark Shores comes from the massive corpses littering that area, but those are just differently sized and rotated models of the scavenger boss from Falling Leaves. In fact, pretty much anywhere you see only part of a Nevron, their entire model is there, it's just carefully hidden by the terrain. The baptismal font that you dump chroma into is the head of the White Benessier. Its body is just sitting right below the map. The top hats on graves in Visage are just the tops of Chapelier Nevrons buried in the mounds. The weird corals seen all over Flying Waters are actually the backs of the massive Bourgeons. Sandfall didn't chop these into separate assets because they didn't have to. They just hid them well enough to create visual interest in the environment while getting to reuse models that they already created. My favorite examples of this reuse, though, are two of the axons. Haller, the massive dead axon in Old Lumiere, uses an Orphelon Nevron's body, just scaled up to a very large size. And then there's the version of the Reacher created for Mael and Alicia's scene, whose model is actually just an Echassier body with a huge structure placed on top. Real quick before we leave the Reacher, when you remove the fog, you notice that the landscape is littered with stumps. All that lumber had to come from somewhere. Sandfall also left themselves a lot of little notes throughout the game. I showed a few in my last video, but here's a few new ones. Near the small white Bourgeon, going out of bounds reveals the quest reward that gets teleported in later, along with a message telling QA testers to be gone. In the Spring Meadows upside-down house, there's an exit blocked by debris. Inside that debris is a dev message suggesting this was meant to be an alternate path. There are a bunch of these abandoned little pockets throughout the game, like in the Monolith, this part here in Frozen Hearts, and also in the Reacher. The last message I found just says Little Merchant Street in Lumiere, and above that message is a wooden platform holding Expeditioner corpses. My guess is this was meant for Act 3 Lumiere, but strangely you never see any Expeditioner bodies in Act 3, and you still don't have access to this platform. Pretty weird. This next one feels like something we were definitely meant to find. Up in Aline's greenhouse at the top of the mansion in Alicia's prologue, there's a large painting of the world map. What's interesting is that this looks like an earlier version, with different terrain and location icons that don't exist in the final game and were likely cut content. And then we have the Stonewave Cliffs Lighthouse. You can see it from afar, but when you go up there, it really feels like a planned location that was cut. There's flower petals, dead bodies, an archway, and it has some serious boss arena energy. Maybe this was originally meant for our confrontation with Painted Renoir, or the Lampmaster. A lot of cutscenes teleport characters around when they're off camera or poses them in weird ways that we can't see. Here you can see Lune glitching during the Reacher cutscene, Verso staring intently at whatever's happening to his hand, and then there's Lune looking downright creepy early in Spring Meadows. This next one isn't exactly hidden, but it doesn't strike you until you zoom out. The giant stone pillars at Eskier's nest actually look like massive nails, all angled as if they were thrown from the sky. And then up top, these statues look like they're taking cover from incoming fire. It feels intentional even if it's never explained outright. Over in Verso's drafts, there's not much cut content to see, which makes sense being released after the game's launch. What's interesting though are the books that are scattered around and floating through the air. Some of them contain sheet music that's actually pretty legible, and here's Verso's theme, which to me looks like it lines up with the actual music. Over in Oskio's area, removing the fog reveals giant pieces of Esquier everywhere, like Oskio's been tearing them apart for generations. And if you drop below the map during the cutscene before his fight, half of Oskio's model is just sitting there. Alright, so the last thing I want to talk about is something I noticed in the ending. After Renoir opens up the window to show Aline in her weakened state, We can see his atelier behind her, which we're already familiar with. But what's weird is that in the corners there are these goopy paint sculptures. The problem is, those don't exist in the real-world mansion. They only exist in the version of the mansion that's inside the canvas. They don't appear in Alicia's prologue, which is our only real glimpse of the real-world mansion. So the question is, why are they here? Is it just a dev oversight? Was Renoir lying to Maëlle, fabricating this image to convince her to leave the canvas? And bear with me for a sec, is this actually the mansion within the canvas, meaning Alicia's hiding spot was inside her crappy painted version of the mansion? Or are these paint forms a manifestation of Aline's illness, spreading the longer she remains in the canvas? It's fun to think about. Personally, I lean toward dev oversight, mainly because we also see objects that only exist in the real-world mansion, like the table with the booze and cake, certain paintings, and these plants. Still, it's hard to unsee those paint sculptures once you notice them. Anyway, let me know what you think about this or any of the other stuff I found. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.